Welcome to Late Night Explainer. Tonight, let me tell you about a man who lent money to kings and took mountains as collateral. Not gold, not jewels, not chests of coin carried under guard through the night. Mountains. Whole seams of silver running through the rock of the Alps, the dark veins of copper buried under the hills of Central Europe. When a prince came to him short of cash, desperate, with a war to fund or an election to win, this man did not simply hand over a loan and hope to be repaid. He took the prince's mines, the silver of Schwaz deep in the Tyrol, the copper of a place called Neusohl in what is now Slovakia. He turned a king's promise, which is a fragile and slippery thing, into something he could hold in his hand, something he could weigh and refine and sell. He lent paper and ink, and he took the earth itself as security. His name was Jakob Fugger, and for a brief, astonishing stretch of the early 16th century, he may have been the richest private individual who ever lived. Richer, by some estimates, than any of the names you'd reach for today. And here is the first small mystery of the evening, the one I want you to hold loosely as you settle in. If he was that rich, that powerful, a man who quite literally bought a Holy Roman Emperor with his own money, why have you almost certainly never heard his name? Why did all that wealth, all that power, that empire, built on mountains and credit and information, simply fade out of the world's memory like breath off a cold window pane? We're going to get there. Slowly. There's no hurry tonight. Where in the world are you listening from this evening? I genuinely wonder when I record these, who's out there in the dark with me? A bedroom somewhere, a long drive, a quiet house, after everyone else has gone to sleep. If you'd like to, leave a note in the comments and tell me where you are. And if you're new here and you find that a slow story told gently helps you drift off, you might want to subscribe so the next one finds its way to you when you need it. But for now, just settle, let your shoulders drop. There's nothing you need to follow closely, nothing you need to remember in the morning. This is a story that will keep itself. We're going to walk back 5 centuries and more into the narrow streets of a German trading town, and we're going to follow one family from a tax register to the throne rooms of Europe, and then much later and much more quietly, all the way back down again. You can come as far as you like. You can fall asleep at any point along the way, and the story will simply go on without you, the way old stories do. So, the mountains, I want to start there because the mountains are the secret. Most people who tell this story start somewhere else. They start with the headline, the part that's easy to say in a single sentence: richest man in history, bought an emperor, funded the Pope, and those things are true, more or less, and we'll come to all of them. But they're the surface of the story, the part that glitters. The real engine, the thing that actually made the Fuggers different from every other ambitious merchant family of their age, was quieter and stranger than gold. It was the idea of turning a debt into a thing, of refusing to let a powerful man pay you back in mere promises. Picture how it usually went in those days when a prince needed money, and princes always needed money. War was the great devourer, a campaign against a rival, a fortress to be built, an army to be paid, a daughter to be married off with a dowry grand enough to bind 2 ruling houses together. The treasury was empty because the treasury was always empty, and the taxes wouldn't come in until next year, and the war was this year. So the prince would go to the merchants and the bankers, hat metaphorically in hand, and ask for a loan. And the banker would have to decide, how likely is it really that this man will pay me back? Princes were not in the habit of being sued. There were no courts that could compel a king. If he chose not to repay you, or could not, you had very little recourse beyond your own ruin and the quiet satisfaction of being right. This is the problem at the heart of all early banking, and it's worth sitting with for a moment because once you feel it, the whole rest of the story opens up. To lend to a king is to take on a risk that you cannot enforce. You are betting on a man's honor and his solvency, and powerful men are notoriously short on both when the bill comes due. So most lenders charged enormous interest to cover the danger, and even then they lost fortunes when a debtor turned his back. Jakob Fugger looked at this problem the way a clever person looks at a lock. And his answer was elegant. He said, in effect, I will lend you the money you need. But I don't want your promise. Promises are air. I want your mines. Think about what that does. A mine is not a promise. A mine is a hole in the earth out of which silver or copper comes day after day, season after season, whether or not the prince is feeling honest, whether or not his war went well, whether he lives or dies. If you control the output of a working mine, you don't have to chase a king for repayment. The repayment comes up out of the ground on its own, carried in carts by workers who don't care about politics, refined and sold by your own agents. You've converted the most unreliable asset in the world, a royal IOU, into the most reliable one, a stream of metal pulled from rock. You've made the debt physical. You've made it a thing you can stand on. And so when Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol came looking for money, in the year 1487 Jakob Fugger gave it to him, and in return he received as security the output of the silver mines at Schwaz. Now hold that name a moment. Schwaz, a town in the Tyrol, up in the mountains of what's now Western Austria. Because Schwaz at that time was not some minor diggings. It was one of the great silver sources of all Europe. The galleries ran deep into the mountain, and out of them came a river of silver. By taking the output of Schwaz as his collateral, Jakob Fugger had not lent against a prince's good name, he had lent against a mountain, and mountains, as a rule, do not default. That single arrangement became the pattern. The blueprint. Lend cash to a cash-poor prince. Take repayment not in coin, which the prince did not have, but in the operating rights to his mines, which he did have, and which he was usually too proud or too desperate or too short-sighted to value properly. Over and over across the decades, the Fuggers ran this same play. A sovereign would arrive needing money for a war or a crown or a wedding, and he would leave having signed away the silver and the copper coming out of his land for years to come. The Fuggers, you might say, collected mountains the way other men collected debts. And they did it so patiently, so methodically, that within a generation they didn't just lend money in the mining business, they were the mining business, or a great deal of it. The copper came a little later, but it came in a way that mattered even more because copper was strategic. Down in the hills around a town called Neusohl, which today is called Banska Bystrica, in the heart of Slovakia, lay some of the richest copper deposits in Central Europe, and copper, in the age of the cannon, was not jewelry. Copper made bronze, and bronze made guns. Mix copper with tin, and you have the metal of artillery, the thing that knocked down castle walls and decided wars. Mix copper with zinc and you have brass, which the whole world wanted. To control copper was to control something kings needed in order to remain kings, and the Fuggers came to control a vast share of the European copper market, shipping it out across the continent, down the rivers, through the great trading port of Antwerp, out into markets that reached the edge of the known world. So that is the engine, the deep machinery, and we'll keep coming back to it. Not gold lying in a vault. Loans turned into mountains. A family that lent to the powerful and took, in exchange, the very earth those powerful men stood on. Hold that image as we go further back, because everything that follows the empire bought, the Pope financed, the strange little village of pensioners still praying today, all of it grows from this one cold, clever idea. But to understand how a man came to be in a position to take a prince's mountains, we have to go back further still, much further. Past Jakob Fugger himself before he was even born, to a single line of ink in a tax register in a German town more than a century earlier. The year is 1367, the place is Augsburg. Now Augsburg, let me set it in your mind gently because the place is part of the story. Augsburg was a free imperial city, which is a phrase worth pausing on. It meant the town answered to no local duke or count, no petty lord skimming its trade for his own purse. It answered, in theory, only to the emperor himself far away, and in practice it largely governed itself through its own councils and its own merchant families. A free imperial city was a place where a man of no birth could rise if he was clever and lucky and tireless, because the old rules of blood and land mattered a little less inside its walls than they did out in the countryside. Augsburg was a place where money could become a kind of nobility all its own, and Augsburg sat in a remarkable spot on the map. It lay on the great trade routes that crossed the Alps, the roads and rivers that linked the wealth of Italy, and above all of Venice, to the markets of northern Europe and the German lands. Think of it as a hinge. To the south, over the mountains, lay Venice, the gateway to the Mediterranean, to the spices and silks and cottons of the East, to the most sophisticated commercial techniques the world then knew. To the north lay the German cities and their merchants and their hunger for southern goods. And Augsburg sat right where those two worlds met and traded. Anything that moved between Italy and Germany had a fair chance of passing through, or near, or being handled by someone in Augsburg. It was a town that lived on the movement of goods over distance, on the patient business of buying low in one place and selling high in another, with the cost and risk of the journey in between. That distance, that gap between where a thing was cheap and where it was dear, that is where merchant fortunes are made, and the Fuggers would one day master distance more completely than almost anyone alive, but not yet. In 1367 there were no Fugger fortunes, there was only a man arriving. In that year, a weaver named Hans Thurzó came to Augsburg. He came from a nearby village called Graben, a little place out in the countryside, a few miles off. He was, in the language of the time, an incomer, a migrant, a man arriving from elsewhere to try his luck in the bigger town. And we know he arrived, we know it with a strange and humble precision because of that line in the tax register I mentioned. The clerk who kept the books of Augsburg, recording who lived in the town and who owed what, wrote down the new arrival. And the entry, in the dog Latin of municipal bookkeeping, reads, Fugger advenit. Fugger has arrived. I love that detail, and I want you to sit with it for a moment because of everything that's coming. Everything. The emperor's bought, the pope's money handled, the richest fortune in the history of the world, as some would have it. All of it begins not with a battle or a coronation or a great inheritance, but with two words scratched in a tax ledger by a bored clerk. A weaver from a village has arrived in town, and now he must pay his tax like everyone else. Fugger has arrived. The clerk had no idea. How could he? He was simply doing the most ordinary thing in the world, writing down a name so the town could collect what it was owed. He did not know that he was recording the first faint sound of one of the great fortunes of history clearing its throat. And there is something else lovely about that beginning, something the whole story will turn on later in ways no one could have guessed in 1367. The family began with bookkeeping, with a written record, with the act of putting a name and a number down on a page so that it would not be forgotten. The clerk who wrote Fugger advenit was, without knowing it, performing in miniature the exact thing that would one day make the Fuggers richer than kings. The keeping of accounts, the writing down of who owes what to whom, the whole vast machine the family would build, the ledgers spanning half of Europe, The network of letters carrying news from city to city, the careful tracking of every loan and every debt across a dozen branches in a dozen lands, all of it is just that first humble act grown enormous. A name and a number written down so they would not slip away. But again, not yet, for now there is only Hans the weaver paying his tax, setting up his loom, beginning the long, patient, unglamorous work of making cloth. And what cloth was it? The family business in those early generations was a fabric called fustian. Now, fustian is one of those words that has nearly fallen out of the language, so let me explain it simply. The way you'd explain it to someone half asleep who's never heard it. Fustian was a blend. It was woven from cotton and linen together, cotton being the soft fibre that came up from the warmer lands of the Mediterranean and beyond, and linen being the sturdy thread spun from the flax that grew well in the cooler north. Mix them on the loom and you get fustian, a cloth that was tougher than pure cotton and softer and cheaper than fine wool, a practical, hard-wearing fabric that ordinary people could afford and would actually wear. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't the silk of princes. It was the honest cloth of working people, and there was steady, dependable money in it, the kind of money that doesn't make you rich overnight, but doesn't ruin you either. And here, already, you can see the future faintly, because fustian needed cotton, and the cotton came up over the Alps from the south through the trade that flowed from Venice. So the Fuggers, from the very beginning, were not just weavers sitting at a loom in one town. They were tied into the long-distance trade. They imported the raw cotton, and they brought in finished textiles as well, all of it moving along that transalpine route through Venice, that hinge between south and north. The family that would one day take silver mines as collateral began by understanding in their bones how goods move over distance, how value is created in the gap between where a thing is made and where it is wanted. They learned the trade roads early. They learned them as weavers, modestly, and they never forgot the lesson. Over the generations, the modest weaving family grew. The sons did well. The business broadened from making cloth to trading in it, from trading in cloth to dealing in money and goods of every kind. The slow upward climb of a merchant family that knows its work and marries shrewdly and reinvests its gains instead of spending them. And at a certain point, the family split into two branches, two separate lines descended from the same root. And this is a small detail, but a charming one, because they told themselves apart by their coats of arms. One branch took as its emblem a roe deer, and so they were called the Fugger-Zeitungen, the Fuggers of the roe deer. The other branch took a lily, and they were the Fugger-Zeitungen, the Fuggers of the lily. Two families, one origin, distinguished by a deer and a flower painted on a shield. And it was the lily line, the Fugger-Zeitungen, that would become the famous one, the one that climbed and climbed until it touched the imperial crown itself. The roe deer branch faded into the ordinary background of history, as most branches of most families do. But the lily flowered into something the world had never quite seen before. It's a small thing, 2 arms, a deer, and a lily. But I find I like knowing it. It reminds you that these were real people, choosing their symbols, painting their shields, distinguishing one set of cousins from another, with no idea which of them history would remember. And out of that lily line in the year 1459, a child was born who would carry the family further than anyone before or since. Jakob Fugger. Later, much later, the world would attach a nickname to him that says everything in 2 words, Jakob Fugger the Rich. In German, Jakob Fugger der Reiche. He would live until 1525, and into those 66 years he would pack a rise so steep and so strange that we will be the rest of this story climbing it together. But, and here is the part that I always find quietly astonishing, here is the second little thread I want you to hold loosely as you drift. The man who would one day finance popes and crown an emperor, very nearly never went into business at all. He was very nearly a priest. Let me tell you how that came to be, because it tells you something about how families thought in those days. Jakob was not the eldest son, the one groomed to inherit the family firm. He was not the second or the third. Jakob Fugger was the 10th child of 11, the 10th of 11 children. Imagine that household, the noise of it, the sheer number of mouths, the older brothers already moving into the family business by the time the younger ones were small. In a large merchant family, the firm and the fortune would pass through the elder sons, the ones positioned to carry on the trade. The younger children had to be placed elsewhere, found other paths, settled into other lives, so they would not simply be a drain on the house. And one of the most respectable paths for a younger son in that age was the church. The church was a great institution, wealthy, powerful, a career as much as a calling, and a clever boy from a good family could rise within it to comfort and influence, and even riches of a churchly kind. So a portion of the family's ambition for young Jakob was pointed not at the counting house, but at the altar. As a boy, he was given what was called a benefice. Now, a benefice, in plain terms, was a position in the church that came attached to an income, a living. To hold a benefice was to be supported by church revenues set on the road toward a clerical career, marked out, in a sense, for God rather than for trade. The boy who would grow up to handle the indulgence money that helped provoke the Protestant Reformation, the boy who would become the banker of the papacy, was himself in his childhood a holder of a church living destined for the clergy.
I find that almost unbearably ironic, and I want you to tuck it away gently because it's going to come back. The man who would stand at the very center of the great financial machine of the late medieval church, the man whose money would help fund the sale of indulgences that so enraged Martin Luther that he nailed his protest to a door and split Christendom in two. That man began as a boy marked for the priesthood, held a benefice, was meant to give his life to the church.
Instead, he would give the church his money and take in return a great deal of the church's. But we are getting ahead. Tuck it away. He was nearly a priest, remember that, even as you fall asleep. Because, of course, it didn't happen. The path bent. The family's plans shifted, as family plans do, with deaths and needs and opportunities, and young Jakob was pulled out of the clerical road and into the family trade instead. The church lost a benefice holder, and the world of money gained the man who would master it more completely than anyone of his time. And once he was in the business, the family did with him what ambitious merchant families did with their most promising young men. They sent him to learn the trade where the trade was sharpest. They sent him to Venice. Venice. Say the name slowly. In the late 15th century, Venice was the great commercial city of Europe, a city built on water and on trade, the meeting point of East and West, where the goods of the whole world changed hands and where the techniques of business were more advanced, more sophisticated, more cunning than anywhere else in Christendom. To learn money and trade in Venice was like learning a craft from the finest masters alive. It was the great school, and the German merchants who came to Venice to trade and to learn had a home there, a single great building that served as their base, their warehouse, their lodging, their counting house, all at once. It was called the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, which means, roughly, the German trading house, the Germans' depot. There, on the edge of the Grand Canal, the German merchants stored their goods and did their business and learned the Venetian way. And it was there, in Venice, at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, that young Jakob Fugger learned the things that would make him. He learned the Venetian methods of commerce, the practical machinery of long-distance trade and finance. And among the things he learned, two matter more than all the rest for the story we're telling. He learned bookkeeping, the careful, disciplined art of recording every transaction, every debt and every credit so that a man could know, truly know, the state of his business at any moment. And he learned the use of bills of exchange. Let me unfold that last one a little, gently, because it's the kind of clever, invisible machinery that makes great fortunes possible, and almost no one ever explains it. A bill of exchange was a way of moving money across great distances without actually carting the coins from one place to another. Think how dangerous it was in those days to physically move a chest of gold along the roads of Europe, over the Alps, through forests and past bandits and toll-takers and thieves. Now imagine instead a piece of paper. A merchant in Venice who is owed money in Antwerp and a merchant in Antwerp who is owed money in Venice can simply settle their accounts on paper, each paying out locally what the other is owed far away, and balancing it all in the ledgers so that the actual gold never has to travel at all. The money moves, but only as ink and trust and arithmetic. It is, in a sense, the ancestor of every wire transfer that hums invisibly around the world today. A way of making distance disappear, of paying a debt 1,000 miles away with nothing but a written promise that another merchant will honor. Do you see how this is all of a piece? The young man learning bills of exchange in Venice is the same young man who will one day take mountains as collateral, who will one day run a network of letters carrying news across all of Europe before that news was public, who will one day keep consolidated accounts across a dozen branches in a dozen cities. It is all the same gift, the gift for making distance and time legible, for turning the vast, slippery, dangerous world of far-off places and uncertain futures into something written down, something readable, something a careful man could hold in his ledger and understand. That was the true Fugger genius, not greed exactly, though there was greed, not luck, though there was luck. It was the patient mastery of distance and time through writing and reckoning. The boy who was nearly a priest came home from Venice instead with the most powerful tools a merchant could carry, and he came home into a family already reaching, already growing, already pivoting from the modest, honest cloth of fustian towards something far larger and far harder and far more dangerous. Because the cloth, you see, was only ever the foundation. The fustian was the ground floor. It made the family solid, respectable, well-connected along the trade routes, supplied with capital and credit, and a name that merchants trusted. But Jakob Fugger, with his Venetian training, his bookkeeping, his understanding of how money could move as paper and how value lived in the gaps of distance, Jakob Fugger was about to take all of it and aim it somewhere no weaver's family had any business aiming. He was about to take it up into the mountains, into the silver and the copper, into the empty treasuries of desperate princes. He was about to turn a textile fortune into a mining empire, and a mining empire into a bank, and a bank into the quiet, unseen hand behind the thrones of Europe. The river of silver from Schwaz, the copper of Neusohl, the loans that bound an emperor. The letter still to come, in which a merchant would scold the most powerful man in Christendom in writing and remind him to whom he owed his crown. The strange little walled village in Augsburg where, even now, even tonight, the poor are housed almost for free in exchange for a prayer. And the long, slow fade at the end, the fortune bleeding out quietly through one debtor too big to refuse. All of that begins here, with a benefice set aside, with a young man stepping off the road from Venice with bookkeeping in his head and bills of exchange in his hands, walking back into Augsburg toward a family business that was about to become something the world had never seen. He had learned how to make distance disappear. Now he would learn how to make kings depend on him. And the first thing he would do, the move that turned everything, was to look at a prince in need of money and ask for his mountain instead. Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol was, by most measures, a man who lived too richly for what he actually owned. He presided over a court of considerable elegance, maintained ambitions that outran his income, and waged wars that cost more than his revenues could absorb. He was not unusual in this among the princes of the late 15th century. Most of them were perpetually short of money, perpetually promising things they could not immediately pay, perpetually looking for someone willing to advance the gap between what they needed today and what they hoped to collect tomorrow. The economy of medieval and early Renaissance power ran on that gap. Princes had land, they had titles, they had rights over rivers and forests and the people who lived near them, but they rarely had ready coin at the moment they needed it most. And the moment they needed it most was always now, always urgent, always framed as a matter of survival or honor or the defense of Christendom against some threat that could not wait for the harvest. Jakob Fugger understood this. He had watched it in Venice, observed how the Venetian merchants had built an entire civilization of credit on exactly this asymmetry. The man with the coin and the man with the future claim on something valuable, and the patient, careful art of bridging them. He had learned to read a balance sheet as a landscape, to see where value was accumulating and where it was only promised, to understand that the distance between a debt and its collateral was the terrain in which fortunes were made or lost. And when he came back to Augsburg with all of that in his head, he looked around at the princes of the German lands and he saw not deadbeats, but opportunities. He saw men who sat on mountains of real physical wealth, ore, timber, salt, silver beneath the earth, but who could not get at it fast enough to meet their immediate obligations. He saw the gap. And in 1487 he stepped into it. The arrangement he made with Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol that year was not, in form, particularly unusual for the time. A wealthy merchant lends money to a prince who needs it. The prince promises to repay. But the terms Jakob negotiated were different from the simple promises of repayment that had ruined other creditors before him. Sigismund needed the cash urgently enough that he was willing to offer something more solid than a future promise. He was willing to offer the output of the Schwaz silver mines in Tyrol, one of the richest silver sources in all of Europe at that time. Not a promise to repay from silver revenues someday. The actual physical output of the mine delivered as repayment in kind, with Fugger agents present to receive it. This is the move that changed everything. Think of it the way you might think of a mortgage today, but inverted. When a bank lends you money to buy a house, the house secures the loan. If you cannot repay, the bank takes the house. What Jakob did with Sigismund was something stranger and more powerful. He lent money and received the mine's production as the repayment mechanism itself, so the ore was not merely the security, it was the payment, streaming back to him continuously as long as the debt lasted. He was not owed a mountain. He was owed the mountain's output, and his agents would be there to collect it, weighed and counted, season by season. The mountain kept producing, the debt kept being repaid, and in the meantime, Jakob Fugger controlled the flow of Tyrolean silver. Schwaz, at its height, was an extraordinary place. The mines beneath those alpine slopes drew thousands of workers, miners who descended into darkness daily, smelters who processed the ore in the heat above ground, merchants who moved the resulting silver out through mountain passes toward the trading cities of Europe. Silver from Schwaz moved through Augsburg, through Venice, outward into the arteries of continental commerce. To have a claim on that output was to have a claim on one of the primary veins of European monetary supply. It was not a small thing, it was the kind of thing that made merchants into something that resembled powers in their own right. And Jakob Fugger recognized it. He did not stop at one loan, one mine, one archduke. What he had found in the Schwaz arrangement was a pattern, a template, a method. Lend to a prince who is cash poor but asset rich. Accept repayment not in future promises but in present production, in output, in the physical substance of wealth rather than the paper promise of it. Make the collateral real, make it flow, make it impossible to argue with. The mine does not default. The mine does not get into a war and run short of coin. The mine simply continues to be a mine, and as long as it does, the debt is being serviced in the most tangible form imaginable. This was the Fugger pattern, and it would repeat itself across the next decades with remarkable consistency, always with some variation in the prints, always with some different metal in the ground, but always with the same essential shape. The next great application of that pattern came in the east, in the mountains of what is today Slovakia, in the region then known as the Hungarian Kingdom, around the town of Neusohl, the place now called Banska Bystrica. There was copper. Not just any copper, but copper in quantities substantial enough to matter to all of Europe. Copper that would, if properly extracted, processed, and distributed, make whoever controlled it a significant force in the continent's economy of metals. Copper was not glamorous the way silver was. It did not ring with the same resonance as gold. But copper was strategic in a way that silver and gold sometimes were not, because copper, alloyed with tin, made bronze, and bronze made cannon. And cannon, in the late 15th century, were increasingly the thing that determined who won wars. Copper, alloyed with zinc, made brass, and brass made the fittings and mechanisms of a civilization. To control European copper was to sit at a choke point of the military and industrial supply chains of the era, in a way that simply having silver did not accomplish. But getting at the copper of Neusohl required more than capital. The mines there had a problem that money alone could not solve: water. Underground mining in any era before mechanical pumping is perpetually threatened by groundwater. As miners dig deeper in pursuit of the ore, they enter zones where water seeps in from the surrounding rock, pooling, flooding, making the lower reaches of the mine impassable. The deeper the good ore, the worse the flooding, and the Neusohl copper lay in places that were wet and getting wetter. What was needed was not just cash, but engineering. A man who understood how to drain mines, how to manage the underground hydrology of a large ore body, how to keep men working in levels that would otherwise fill with water. That man was Hans Thurzó, known also as Hans Thurzó, a member of a family with deep experience in mining operations across the Carpathian region. Thurzó brought with him something Jakob Fugger did not have: specific, hard-won technical knowledge about how to make a problematic mine productive. He knew drainage systems, tunneling techniques, the management of mine infrastructure across a large operation. What he did not have in sufficient quantity was capital. The money needed to build those systems, hire those workers, sustain operations through the years it would take to make the Neusohl mines properly profitable. The solution was obvious to both men. In 1495, they formed what became known as the Thurzó-Fugger Company. Thurzó brought the metallurgical expertise, the on-the-ground knowledge, the understanding of ore and water and rock. Fugger brought the capital and, crucially, the distribution network, the commercial connections that stretched from Augsburg to Antwerp to Venice, the ability to move copper across Europe and place it into the hands of buyers who needed it. Together they combined the things that neither had alone: technical knowledge of extraction joined to financial depth and commercial reach. The result was, over the following years, nothing less than the domination of the European copper market. Think of what that meant in practice, when rulers across Europe needed bronze for their cannon foundries, when merchants needed brass for their workshops, when the instruments of late medieval industry required copper in its various forms. The supply chain that served them increasingly ran through the Fugger-Thurzó operation. From the mines beneath the Carpathian foothills, through smelting operations and processing facilities, out through Antwerp, which was becoming the great commercial hub of northern Europe in this period, the place where goods from the south met buyers from the north, and from there into the hands of the continent's manufacturers and armourers and craftsmen. The Fuggers were not merely selling copper, they were managing the entire journey of the metal from the earth to the market. Part of what made this possible was a particular technical process called the Saigerprozess, the liquation process, practiced in facilities known as Saigerhütten. The ore at Neusohl and similar deposits was not pure copper. It was a mixture with silver distributed through it in quantities too small to recover by simple smelting, but too significant to ignore. The liquation process was a method of separating that silver from the copper, exploiting the different melting points and behaviors of the two metals when treated with lead at specific temperatures. It was a complex, multi-stage operation that required skill, experience, and careful management, but the reward was considerable. You ended up with both the copper and the silver that had been hidden inside it, essentially extracting two valuable metals from ore that cruder operations would have sold for only one. The Fuggers controlled this process. They had the expertise through Thurzó's networks and their own hired specialists. They owned or controlled smelting facilities. They managed transport from mine to furnace to market. In the language of modern business, they had achieved vertical integration across an entire industry, a rare feat for any era, but particularly striking for the late 15th century, when most merchants operated at one stage of the process and sold to the next. To control extraction, refining, and sale simultaneously was to control the margins at every step and to have a comprehensive view of costs and values that no single stage competitor could match. It was, in miniature, the same logic as the bookkeeping. Complete information across the whole system gave you an advantage that partial information could not replicate. And through all of this, the Fugger family's position in Augsburg was transforming. They were no longer the prosperous textile merchants of Hans Fugger's legacy, comfortably wealthy but operating within the familiar world of cloth and trade. They were something new. They were financiers of princes, controllers of strategic resources, nodes in the supply chain of European power. The shift was not just in the scale of their wealth, but in its nature and its reach. A textile merchant's wealth was limited by what the cloth market would bear, by the competition of other merchants, by the rhythms of seasonal demand. A man who controlled a significant portion of Europe's copper supply and who held claims on the silver output of Tyrolean mountains was playing a different game entirely, one with different rules and different leverage over the world around him. It was from this position, from this mining and metals foundation, that the banking of the Habsburgs grew naturally and almost inevitably. Because the Habsburgs, those endlessly ambitious rulers who were accumulating titles and thrones and dynastic obligations at a pace that outstripped their actual revenue, needed money constantly. They needed it for wars. They needed it for the diplomatic arrangements by which marriages were contracted and alliances sealed. They needed it for the simple maintenance of an imperial court that was expected to project power and magnificence while actually running perpetually behind its ambitions. Maximilian the Fetter, who ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1508 until his death in 1519, was in many ways the embodiment of this predicament, a man of grand vision and chronic cash shortage, full of schemes and campaigns and plans for dynastic consolidation that were always just beyond what his actual revenues could sustain. Jakob Fugger became Maximilian's principal financier. The relationship built gradually, one loan at a time, each loan generating a need for the next, because the underlying problem, a ruler who spent more than he collected, was structural, not temporary. Each time Maximilian needed money, Fugger was there. Each time Fugger provided it, he received something in return: mining rights, repayment from imperial revenues, political favor, protection. The relationship was not simple charity or even simple business. It was a symbiosis, each party providing something the other could not obtain anywhere else on comparable terms. Maximilian needed a financier with the capital and the organizational capacity to actually deliver large sums on short notice. The European financial markets of the time had very few institutions capable of that, and Fugger needed the political protection, the access, and the commercial rights that only a powerful prince could grant. They were bound to each other by mutual dependency, and the binding grew tighter with each transaction. One of the things it is worth pausing to understand is the sheer organizational challenge of what Jakob Fugger was doing. Moving money in the late 15th and early 16th century was not simple. There were no electronic transfers, no telephone calls to branch offices, no standardized clearing systems. To lend large sums to a ruler in Vienna or Innsbruck while your headquarters were in Augsburg, to receive repayment in the form of mine output while your sales operations were in Antwerp, to maintain accounts that accurately reflected the state of your finances across a dozen cities simultaneously. All of this required an administrative infrastructure of remarkable sophistication. It required people, trusted agents posted across Europe, writing letters, keeping records, reporting back. It required the accounting systems Jakob had learned in Venice, adapted and scaled to something larger than any single Venetian merchant house had attempted. It required, in essence, a bureaucracy, a small, private bureaucracy, but a bureaucracy nonetheless, with procedures and standards, and the kind of organizational discipline that turned individual reliability into institutional reliability. The loans to Maximilian helped fund his wars, the Italian campaigns, the struggles against the French, the perpetual defensive and offensive maneuvering that characterized imperial politics. They helped fund the dynastic arrangements that were Maximilian's true genius and lasting achievement, the careful deployment of marriages as political instruments. And through it all, Fugger's position grew. In 1511, the family's elevation began. Jakob was granted noble status, and in 1514 he was made a Reichsgraf, an imperial count, by the very emperor whose debts he held. A Reichsgraf, Count of the Holy Roman Empire. The grandson of a weaver registered in the Augsburg tax rolls under a name the clerk had spelled phonetically. The 10th child who was meant to enter the clergy had become a count. The title carried real significance in the social order of the time. Admission to a rank that in theory required generations of noble blood and military honor granted here to a man whose weapon was a ledger and whose campaign was conducted in interest rates. It was a transaction, of course, as nearly everything between Fugger and the Habsburgs was. The ennoblement was not a gift freely given from admiration, though some genuine admiration may have been present. It was part of the ongoing exchange, a non-monetary payment, in a world where social status was itself a form of currency. For Fugger, the title changed his standing in ways that mattered practically. It gave him access to aristocratic spaces, to the kind of negotiations that were conducted among people who recognized each other as peers, to a social register that opened doors which a wealthy commoner, however wealthy, could not easily walk through. For Maximilian, it cost him nothing material while purchasing continued access to the one man in the empire who could reliably produce large sums on short notice. And then in 1515 came the Vienna double wedding. Maximilian, always thinking dynastically, always calculating the genealogical chessboard, arranged a magnificent double marriage at the Congress of Vienna. 2 marriages at once, binding the Habsburgs to the Jagiellons, the ruling family of Hungary and Bohemia. The arrangements were complex, involving negotiations about successions and rights, and what would happen if lines died out. The practical result, played out over the following years, was that the Habsburgs gained a claim on the crowns of Hungary and Bohemia that would eventually materialize into actual possession. The Habsburg dominion, already enormous, was being extended further through exactly the kind of dynastic architecture that Maximilian had made his signature. Fugger money was part of the mechanism that made this possible. The Congress itself, the hosting of the dignitaries, the payments and gifts and settlements that accompanied the arrangements. All of this required cash, and Fugger was one of the sources of it. The connection was becoming so deep that it was no longer accurate to think of Jakob Fugger as a banker who happened to do business with the Habsburgs. He was something closer to the financial spine of Habsburg ambition, the enabling condition for their dynastic expansion. Without the Fugger credit line, several of the key moves in Maximilian's grand strategy would have been simply impossible. You could not borrow from the future at that scale from anyone else. You could not find another institution with the capital, the organizational reach, the willingness to lend against mining concessions and imperial revenues, the patience to hold large sovereign debt and wait for repayment. There was effectively one Fugger. This is the thing that tends to get lost in the simpler versions of the story, the ones that present Jakob Fugger as a powerful man who happened to rub shoulders with emperors. The relationship was not incidental to the Habsburgs' success, it was structural. The Habsburgs were building one of the great dynastic empires of European history in this period, adding title after title, throne after throne, assembling through marriage and inheritance the sprawling composite monarchy that would eventually stretch from Spain to Austria to the Americas. And the credit that financed each step of that assembly had a significant portion of its source in Augsburg, in the accounts of one firm, in the head of one man who had spent his apprenticeship learning Venetian bookkeeping and come home to apply it to the cash needs of an empire in formation. There is something worth pausing over here in the quiet of this telling. The way great historical events tend to get explained as the products of ideas or armies or the will of exceptional individuals, and sometimes they are all of those things. But they are also always the products of logistics, of money, of the organizations and systems that move resources from where they accumulate to where they are needed. The Habsburg dynastic expansion of this period was built on real political skill, on genuine diplomatic acuity, on the Habsburgs' own talent for recognizing the value of a good marriage contract. But it was also built on the Fugger credit line. It was built on the fact that when Maximilian needed 50,000 gulden next month and his imperial revenues would not produce them until spring, there was someone in Augsburg who could arrange it and who had the organizational infrastructure to deliver it. History is full of plans that failed because the money did not arrive. The Habsburgs' plans tended to not fail in that particular way because the money arrived. And Jakob Fugger, extending credit to Maximilian year after year, accepting the ennoblement and the mining rights and the repayment streams from imperial revenues, was building something more than a fortune. He was building a position so embedded in the structure of imperial power that extracting it would have required dismantling something essential. The debt was not merely a financial instrument. It was a bond, a form of mutual dependency that tied the greatest political power in Europe to a family from Augsburg who had started in fustian cloth. That dependency was the real collateral, not just the mines, not just the silver and copper, but the structural fact that the Habsburgs could not function at their full ambition without him. The mines in Tyrol kept producing. The Thurzó-Fugger operation in Neusohl kept sending copper westward through Antwerp and into the hands of the continent's cannon founders and metal workers. The Saigerprozess kept separating silver from copper ore, and the silver and the copper both travelled through Fugger distribution networks into European markets. The accounts in Augsburg kept recording it all in the double-entry system, with every debit matched by a credit, every loan noted with its terms and its collateral, every branch's position consolidated into a picture of the whole that no single agent in Venice or Antwerp or Rome could see, but that Jakob Fugger in Augsburg could, because the letters came to him and the bookkeepers worked for him and the accounts answered to him. He was becoming something that did not quite have a name yet. Not a banker in the modern sense, because that institution as we understand it did not exist. Not a merchant, because he had long since transcended the limits of what merchants did. Not a noble, because his power rested on money and information rather than land and armies, even if he now carried a count's title. He was something that the late medieval world was producing in very small numbers. A private institution, an organization with the reach and the systemic importance of a state, but without the form of one, embedded in the interstices between states and drawing its power precisely from that position between them. And Maximilian I was aging. The great dynastic architect, the dreamer of imperial schemes, the man who had run through more money than almost any ruler of his time, was approaching the end. He had one more enormous piece of dynastic work left to him, the arrangement of his grandson's succession. And then the debts and the dreams would pass to others. The mines would still be in the mountains. The copper would still be in the ground beneath Neusohl. The accounts would still be in Augsburg. But the emperor, who had made Jakob Fugger an imperial count, who had borrowed and borrowed and accepted, would soon be gone. And what came next would be the thing the whole structure had been building toward, almost without knowing it. The moment when the price of an empire itself would be placed on the table, and Jakob Fugger would be the one who could pay it. The relationship between Fugger and the Habsburgs had been, up to this point, a relationship of incremental loans and incremental returns, each transaction meaningful but bounded, each one adding to a position that was growing but still comprehensible as a business arrangement. What was coming was something of a different order entirely. Not a loan to fund a campaign, not credit to smooth the gap between a prince's expenditure and his revenues. What was coming was the purchase, if purchase is not too blunt a word, though it is not far wrong, of the most powerful political title in Christendom. And the mechanics of that purchase, the specific way it was arranged, the particular form in which the money moved and the particular nature of what was received in return would make everything that came before it look like prologue. But that is a story for just a little further along this dark and quiet road. For now, let the image sit. A man in Augsburg, surrounded by ledgers and letters, with counts among his titles and mines among his assets, watching the old emperor age and knowing, with the particular clarity of a man who had made himself indispensable, that what came after Maximilian would require someone who could do what only he could do. The loans to Maximilian had built a position. The loans to Maximilian's successor would define an era. And somewhere in the mountains of Tyrol, the silver of Schwaz, it was still being pulled from the earth, weighed, recorded, sent westward through the passes, arriving, as it always arrived, at the ledgers that Jakob Fugger kept in the city on the Transalpine road, where a weaver's family had once scratched a modest living from the cloth trade, and a young man had set off to Venice to learn how money moved, Maximilian. I died in January of 1519 in the town of Wels in Upper Austria, and the question of what came next was not merely a dynastic matter, it was a constitutional one, and the constitution of the Holy Roman Empire was, by design, not a hereditary arrangement. The emperor was not a king passing his crown to his son by right of blood. He was a title chosen by a specific body of men, 7 of them, the prince-electors, each holding his office by virtue of a particular ecclesiastical or secular dignity. The archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne among the church princes, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg among the secular ones. These 7 men met, deliberated, and voted. And in 1519, they were prepared to consider offers. That framing, consider offers, is perhaps the most honest way to approach what happened in the months after Maximilian's death, because what occurred was not simply a political negotiation of the ordinary kind. It was something closer to an auction conducted with elaborate ceremony and dignified language, but an auction nonetheless, in which 2 great princes of Europe put forward their claims and their money, and the 7 men who held the deciding votes understood very well that their decisions had a price. The 2 serious candidates were, in the broad view, an obvious pair of rivals. On one side, Charles I of Spain, Maximilian's grandson through his daughter Juana, a young man of 18 at the time of his grandfather's death, who already held, through inheritance, an extraordinary accumulation of territory, the crowns of Castile and Aragon, the kingdom of Naples and Sicily, the Low Countries, and, from 1516, the wealth beginning to flow from the Spanish claims in the Americas. On the other side, Francis I of France, a monarch of comparable ambition and considerably more personal charisma, who saw in the imperial crown a counterweight to the Habsburg encirclement that already pressed on France from the south and the east. Both men were, in the financial sense, desperate. The cost of mounting a serious campaign for the imperial election, the payments to the electors, the bribes framed as gifts and pensions, the expenses of managing the politics across the German territories, was staggering by any measure. Neither Charles nor Francis had ready money in anything like the quantities required. What they had were promises, territories, future revenues, and the names of bankers willing to advance against those promises. Jakob Fugger had been watching all of this with the attention of a man whose entire position depended on knowing which way it would fall. He had been the principal creditor of Maximilian, and Maximilian's successor was, in the logic of the credit engine he had built, simply the next name on the ledger. But only if the successor was the right name, only if the new emperor would honor the prior obligations and be amenable to the continuation of the arrangement that had made both parties what they were. Francis I was a French king. A French king in possession of the imperial title would reorient the entire political geography of Europe, and in that reorientation, the Augsburg banker, who had grown wealthy on Habsburg need, would find himself suddenly far from the center of things. Charles was the continuation. Charles was the structural choice. So the money moved toward Charles. The total cost of securing the election has been documented at somewhere between 850,000 and 1 million gulden, a figure so large that it is difficult to make it feel real without a point of comparison, though every comparison across centuries carries its own distortions, and those distortions are worth naming honestly. What can be said with confidence is that the amount represented an extraordinary multiple of any single prince's ready cash, that it dwarfed the annual revenues of most European states, and that no single source could have assembled it alone. The Welser banking house contributed, other Augsburg and German merchant firms put in shares, but the largest piece came from Jakob Fugger. The Fugger contribution to the election fund is commonly documented at something in the range of 500,000 to 600,000 gulden, more than half the total by the standard reckoning, advanced by one man in one city, sitting over ledgers that his grandfather's grandfather could not have imagined. The money reached the electors in various forms and through various channels, because the ceremony of the thing required a certain indirection. These were not, formally speaking, bribes. They were pensions, gifts, assurances of future favor, compensation for the considerable expense of traveling to and deliberating at the election. The language was the language of honor and obligation. The arithmetic was the arithmetic of purchase. And on the 28th of June, 1519, the 7 prince-electors cast their votes, and Charles I of Spain was elected Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, as he would be known in the imperial role, and the most powerful political title in Christendom had been secured on credit. It is worth pausing here because the bare fact of it, a banker financing an emperor's election, can come to seem, in the retelling, almost normal, almost a routine transaction in the commerce of power. But it was not normal. Nothing quite like this had happened before at this scale, in this form, with this degree of financial specificity. Jakob Fugger had not merely lent money to a prince who then did the things that princes do. He had specifically funded the mechanism by which a man became the supreme secular authority in Europe. He had, in the most concrete and documented sense, bought a crown. Not for himself. He was not deluded enough to imagine himself on a throne. But the crown would not exist on the head it sat on without his contribution. That is what the title of this long night's telling means when it says, "The bankers who bought kings." The 1519 election is where that phrase stops being metaphor. Charles V owed Jakob Fugger an enormous sum. This was not an abstraction. It was a debt recorded in ledgers in Augsburg, carried in the accounts of a firm that tracked its exposures with the same careful double-entry precision with which it tracked its copper shipments and its textile invoices. And as the years moved forward and the repayment did not arrive with the regularity that the new emperor's vast territories might have suggested, a tension grew. A tension between the scale of what the Fuggers had done and the pace at which they were being compensated for it. In 1523, 4 years after the election, Jakob Fugger sat down and composed a letter to Charles V. The letter survives. It is not a long letter, it is not a deferential one. In it, Fugger stated, with the directness of a man who had decided that the normal protocols of address were less important than clarity, that it was well known that His Imperial Majesty could not have acquired the Roman crown without the help that Jakob Fugger had provided. He pressed for repayment. He reminded the emperor of the specific nature of the obligation. He wrote in the formal language of the time what translated into the plainest possible terms means, "You owe me, and you know it, and I am telling you so in writing." Think for a moment about what that letter represents. Charles V was, by 1523, the most powerful man in Europe. He held more territory than any Christian ruler since Charlemagne. He controlled the revenues of Spain, the Low Countries, Naples, the early flows of American silver and gold. He was Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Low Countries, and a banker in Augsburg wrote him a letter reminding him of his debts in terms that left no room for the pretense that the relationship was anything other than what it was: a creditor addressing a debtor. This is the power inversion that the Fugger story keeps returning to, the detail that distinguishes the Fugger position from the position of merely wealthy men. It was not simply that Jakob had money. Plenty of men across European history have had money. It was that Jakob had made himself so integral to the functioning of the political order, had lent so much to such central actors at such pivotal moments, that the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire could not easily ignore his letters. Charles did not, so far as the record shows, respond warmly or immediately to the 1523 demand. The debts were not cleared with the speed that Fugger wished, but the letter was sent, it was received, and it was not destroyed, which means that somewhere in the imperial administration there was an understanding that the man who had sent it was not someone whose communications could be simply discarded. Jakob was ennobled in 1511, made an imperial count, a Reichsgraf, in 1514. A weaver's descendant, a boy who had held a church benefice and nearly gone into the clergy, bore the title of count before the decade of the election, and bore it by the grant of the emperor, whose campaigns and marriages and schemes the Fugger Bank had financed. The title was, in its way, a form of payment, an acknowledgement that the relationship between the merchant house and the imperial house had moved beyond the ordinary commercial. But a title did not settle a debt. And the debt was large. What happened in parallel with the great political dealings, with Maximilian, with the election, with Charles, was a different kind of entanglement, one that drew the Fugger name into the most consequential religious controversy of the century, and that drew it in through a mechanism that was, at its root, financial. The story is often told as though it moves in a straight line from the Fuggers' involvement to Martin Luther's protest, as though there is a clean causal chain with an Augsburg banker at one end and the Reformation at the other. The honest version is more tangled, more interesting, and in some ways more damning, precisely because it is less dramatic than the simplified account. It begins with Albrecht of Brandenburg. Albrecht was an ambitious ecclesiastical prince who, in the years around 1514 and 1515, held or sought to hold multiple high church positions simultaneously: the Archbishopric of Mainz, the Archbishopric of Magdeburg, and the Bishopric of Halberstadt. Holding multiple bishoprics was itself irregular under canon law and required a papal dispensation. More importantly, acquiring the Archbishopric of Mainz required a substantial payment to Rome, a composition fee as the Church framed it, because Mainz was one of the most important sees in Germany, one of the 3 archbishoprics held by electors, and the papacy charged accordingly for the privilege of its confirmation. The figure Albrecht owed to Rome for the Mainz appointment alone was significant, around 10,000 ducats in composition fees, plus an additional sum in the form of what was called pallium money, the payment for the symbolic vestment that confirmed an archbishop in his office. Albrecht did not have this money. He was a prince of considerable political importance and relatively limited liquid resources, so he did what princes in that era did when they needed ready cash. He borrowed it from the Fuggers. The Fugger firm advanced him the money to pay Rome. Albrecht now owed the Fuggers a substantial debt. The question was how to repay it. Here is where the arrangement becomes, in retrospect, one of the more extraordinary pieces of financial engineering in the history of the Church. Pope Leo XIII was at this time pursuing a project that required enormous resources, the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The old Basilica of Constantine was being demolished. The new basilica, the structure that would eventually take more than a century to complete and would transform the skyline of Rome, required funding on a scale that the ordinary revenues of the papacy could not easily supply. One mechanism available to the papacy was the preaching of indulgences, the theological instrument by which the Church offered, in exchange for charitable contributions, a reduction in the time a soul would spend in purgatory, applying the treasury of merit accumulated by Christ and the saints. Indulgences had been preached for centuries, for various purposes. The St. Peter's indulgence was, in the early 16th century, one of the major ones. Leo X granted Albrecht of Brandenburg the right to preach this indulgence in his territories. The arrangement was straightforward in its financial logic. Proceeds from the indulgence campaign would be split. Half would go to Rome toward the construction of St. Peter's. Half would go to repay Albrecht's debt to the Fugger Bank. The theological instrument of the Church and the commercial instrument of the Augsburg banking house were, in this arrangement, wound together in the same money flow, and the Fuggers, true to their operating method, did not simply extend credit and wait for remittances to arrive. They sent agents. Fugger representatives accompanied the indulgence-selling campaign through the German territories, present at the collection points where the faithful came forward with their contributions, ensuring that the portion earmarked for the repayment of Albrecht's debt was properly separated and directed. The agents were not preaching theology. They were performing accounting, but they were there in the same physical locations at the same tables where Johann Tetzel was delivering his famous sermons on the efficacy of indulgences. Johann Tetzel was the Dominican friar appointed to lead the preaching campaign in Albrecht's territories. He is remembered primarily because of what happened next, and because of a particular form of words attributed to him. The phrase, rendered in various translations, that when a coin in the collection box rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Whether Tetzel said these exact words is a matter historians have debated, but the sentiment attributed to him captured something real about the commercial energy of the campaign, the way the indulgence was being marketed as a transaction with spiritual guarantees attached. The preaching was vivid, effective, and, to certain ears, deeply troubling. One pair of ears belonged to Martin Luther, an Augustinian friar and professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, a man who had been wrestling with questions about grace, repentance, and the nature of salvation for years before the Tetzel campaign moved into the territories near him. In October of 1517, Luther circulated what became known as the 95 Theses, a set of propositions for academic debate, written in Latin, addressed primarily to church authorities, and focused on the theology and practice of indulgences. His objections were theological at their core. The question of whether the Pope had the authority to remit the penalties of purgatory, the question of whether a financial transaction could stand in the place of genuine contrition, the question of what the faithful were actually being promised and whether the promise was one the Church could keep. But Luther's protest was not aimed only at the theology in the abstract. He had a specific campaign in mind, a specific preacher, and a specific financial arrangement that he understood, at least in outline. He knew that the money from the indulgences was flowing in part toward Rome and in part toward debt repayment. He named the Fuggers. In documents from this period, Luther was explicit that the commercial machinery surrounding the indulgence campaign was part of what made it corrupt, that the presence of bankers' agents, the splitting of the proceeds, the fact that contributions from German faithful were traveling to an Augsburg counting house as well as to a Roman building site was precisely the kind of entanglement that undermined the spiritual legitimacy of the whole operation. This is where the honest version of the story differs from the simplified one. The simplified version says, the Fuggers funded the indulgences that started the Reformation. That is not quite right, and it matters to say so clearly. Luther's protest was theological in origin and would almost certainly have found some occasion to emerge regardless of this particular financial arrangement. His intellectual journey had been moving toward these questions for years, and the broader conditions of religious dissatisfaction in Germany were not manufactured by one banker's credit line. What the Fugger-Albrecht-Tetzel arrangement did was give Luther a specific, concrete, visible instance of the kind of corruption he was already disposed to oppose. It was the occasion, not the cause. The distinction is worth holding, and yet the occasion mattered. The specific details of this particular campaign, the way it was structured, the presence of Fugger agents at the collection points, the openly financial character of the whole proceeding, gave Luther's protest a sharp, identifiable target. It gave reformist energy something to organize around, and it gave the Fugger name a prominence in the emerging controversy that the bank might well have preferred to avoid. Luther named the Fuggers with something close to contempt, and he was not alone. Through the 1520s, as the religious controversy broadened and the political tensions of the empire sharpened, the Fuggers found themselves targeted in a different arena as well. Not the theological debate, but the economic and political one. In the assemblies of the Reichstag, the imperial diet that brought together the princes and estates of the Holy Roman Empire, there were sustained debates about what contemporaries called the monopoly question, the question of whether great merchant houses like the Fuggers had accumulated such control over critical commodities that they were effectively operating outside the normal competitive order, fixing prices, cornering markets, and extracting wealth from the rest of the economy in ways that were unfair, ungodly, and contrary to the common good. The anti-monopoly polemics of the 1520s were vigorous, often bitter, and aimed squarely at the Fuggers and the handful of other great commercial houses that had risen to similar dominance in particular markets. The charge was that they controlled the copper trade, that they held mining concessions across so much of Central Europe that no independent producer could compete, that they had made themselves into something more than merchants, something like commercial sovereigns exercising power that properly belonged to princes and political authorities. There was a religious dimension to this criticism, connecting the profit motive to usury, to the sin of avarice, to the corruption of a Christian community by the logic of accumulation without limit. It is worth being honest about these polemics in a particular way. They were not disinterested economic analysis. The men who leveled them in the Reichstag had their own interests in limiting the power of institutions that competed with or held leverage over the territorial princes and the free cities. The charges of monopoly were real enough in their substance. The Fuggers did dominate the copper market to an extraordinary degree, and there is no question that this dominance gave them pricing power that a more fragmented market would not have permitted. But the rhetorical heat of the anti-monopoly debates also served political purposes that had nothing to do with the welfare of ordinary consumers or the spiritual health of the German nation. They were partly a political instrument wielded by people who had reasons to want the great merchant houses constrained or embarrassed. That is not a reason to dismiss them. The structural critique was real. But it is a reason to hold them with some critical distance, to understand them as documents of their moment rather than objective assessments of economic harm. What the polemics could not do in any case was reverse the position the Fuggers had built. The wealth was real, the credit lines were real, the mining concessions were real. The letters of exchange linking Augsburg to Antwerp to Rome to Venice to Nuremberg were real. And the information flowing back along those same routes, the letters from agents in every major European city telling the Fuggers what was happening in the political and commercial world before most princes had heard so much as a rumor, were real. You could write polemics about a man in pamphlet form. You could name him from the pulpit. You could raise the question of monopoly in the Reichstag and pass resolutions. None of it unmade the architecture that the firm had built. The Fuggers did not collapse under the weight of Luther's criticism or the Reichstag's debates. They continued. The firm under Jakob continued to operate with the same precision, the same information advantage, the same willingness to place very large bets on the stability of very large debtors. The architecture held because the architecture was not primarily about any one deal or any one controversy. It was a system, and systems have a momentum that individual shocks, even large ones, do not easily arrest. But the shocks were accumulating, and in 1525 the man who had built the system died. Jakob Fugger died in December of 1525 at 66 years of age in Augsburg. He died childless, which was itself a fact of considerable importance for the firm he left behind. There was no direct heir, no son who had grown up inside the business and understood its every mechanism, no seamless biological continuation of the founder's particular genius for reading credit and risk. The firm passed to his nephews, among whom Anton Fugger, born in 1493, Jakob's nephew, and the son of his brother Georg, would become the dominant figure in the next generation. Jakob was buried with his brothers in the Fugger chapel at St. Anne's Church in Augsburg, a chapel that had been consecrated in 1518 and that is considered among the earliest Renaissance buildings in Germany. The Italian style that Jakob had first encountered as a young man at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice, now made permanent in stone and marble in his home city, a tomb that encoded his biography in its architecture. A man who had taken the commercial forms of the Italian world and planted them deep in the German soil. His epitaph expressed, in the formal Latin of the era, that he had been second to none in the acquisition of extraordinary wealth, not a modest claim, but not an inaccurate one. The chapel was part of a broader pattern of endowment that characterized the last years of Jakob's life, the conversion of accumulated wealth into lasting institutional forms, the giving of a shape to money that transcended the lifespan of the man who had made it. And the most remarkable of those forms, the one that most directly encoded Jakob's particular understanding of the relationship between wealth, obligation, and eternity, had been established 4 years before his death in 1521 in a quiet corner of Augsburg. It was called the Fuggerei, and it remains, more than 5 centuries later, the oldest social housing complex in the world, still in continuous operation. What Jakob built there was a small, self-contained settlement, a walled city within a city, its own gates, its own streets, its own fountain, intended to house the Catholic poor of Augsburg who had fallen into need through no fault of their own. Not the disreputable poor, not the idle or the criminal, but the respectable poor, craftsmen ruined by circumstance, widows left without income, families undone by illness or misfortune in a world that had no other safety net to offer them. He endowed it with sufficient capital that it could sustain itself in perpetuity, and he set the annual rent at 1 Rhenish guilder, a sum that was modest even at the time, and that has remained, by the deliberate and slightly extraordinary decision of the Fugger foundations, essentially unchanged. Today, the residents of the Fuggerei pay 88 euro cents a year, not per month, per year. But the rent is not the strange part, or rather, it is not the strangest part, because alongside the 88 cents, each resident of the Fuggerei is required, by the terms of the original charter that has governed the settlement for 500 years, to pray 3 times daily for the soul of Jakob Fugger and the souls of the Fugger family, the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, the Creed. 3 times a day, every day, for as long as they live within those walls. The Fuggerei is, encoded in its founding documents, a perpetual prayer engine, a machine for generating intercession. Jakob Fugger, who had lent money to emperors and archbishops and popes, who had financed the building of a new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome through mechanisms we will come to shortly, had also, with the same precise contractual mind that ran through every transaction of his life, purchased ongoing spiritual protection for himself and his family at the price of a house and a very low rent. The endowment was the investment, the prayers were the return. It is a peculiarly medieval logic running inside what is also a genuinely innovative institution. Jakob Fugger lived on the hinge between 2 worlds, between the feudal economy of obligation and the emerging capitalist economy of contract, and the Fuggerei holds both at once. It is charity, real and durable charity, that has housed the poor for 5 centuries, that was damaged in the bombing of Augsburg in 1944, and rebuilt and kept open still. And it is also unmistakably a financial instrument, a long-term investment in salvation, structured as carefully as any loan to a Habsburg archduke, with collateral taken in the form of human prayer rather than mountain ore. The Fuggerei is still there. You can visit it. You can see the small stone houses and the quiet courtyard streets, and if you walk through the gates, you are walking into a space that Jakob Fugger designed and endowed in the last years of his life, while simultaneously managing the financial architecture of the Holy Roman Empire. Both things were true of him at once, but to understand how a merchant's family arrived at the position of financing an imperial election, of literally purchasing the crown of the Holy Roman Empire and placing it on a specific head, we need to follow the money back a few years to a moment when the question of who would rule Europe was settled not on a battlefield, but in the counting houses of Augsburg. Maximilian I, the emperor, Jakob had bankrolled through decades of war and dynastic maneuvering died in January of 1519, and the death of an emperor in the constitutional architecture of the Holy Roman Empire was not merely a succession, it was an auction. The imperial crown was elective. It did not pass automatically from father to son or from one Habsburg to the next by the logic of inheritance alone. It was bestowed by 7 prince-electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier and Cologne, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg and the King of Bohemia, men of enormous power and entirely negotiable loyalty, who gathered to choose the next ruler of the largest political entity in Christendom. And in 1519, with Maximilian barely cold, 2 candidates presented themselves and began to spend. Charles I of Spain was Maximilian's grandson, 19 years old, already King of Spain and master of the Spanish territories in Italy and the New World, a young man who had not yet set foot in Germany and whose German was non-existent, but who carried the Habsburg name and the enormous financial backing that name could now command. Francis II of France was his rival, older, personally magnetic, the ruler of the most populous and wealthy kingdom in Western Europe, entirely willing to match or exceed whatever sum was placed before the electors. The competition between them was explicit, documented, and conducted in the language of gulden. The total cost of securing Charles's election is documented, though the figures vary somewhat across sources. What is generally agreed is that the expenditure ran to somewhere in the range of 850,000 to 1 million gulden, a sum so vast that it is almost easier to describe it in terms of what it could have purchased, which was approximately the annual revenues of several medium-sized German principalities combined. The electors were not bribed in any crude or deniable sense. This was the understood mechanism of imperial politics, the recognized price of the crown, paid in the form of gifts, promises and direct cash that flowed to electors and their retinues and the intermediaries who moved the money between them. And the largest single share of that sum came from Jakob Fugger. The figures cited for the Fugger contribution vary, as they do for the total. The historical record does not preserve a single clean ledger entry that settles the question, but the commonly cited range places the Fugger share at somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 gulden. Other banking houses contributed. The Welsers of Augsburg, rivals and sometime partners of the Fuggers, contributed a portion. But Jakob was the primary lender, the anchor of the arrangement, the man whose credit made the number possible. Charles I of Spain became Charles the Mustafa, Holy Roman Emperor, in large part because a merchant son from Augsburg decided to lend him the money. And the debt was not theoretical or ceremonial. It was a documented, enforceable financial obligation sitting on the books of the Fugger firm, and both parties knew exactly what it meant. We know this because of a letter. In 1523, 4 years after the election, Jakob Fugger wrote to Charles the Emperor had been slow to repay. The debt was not being serviced at the pace or in the manner that the agreement required, and so Jakob, who had by then been doing business with princes and emperors for the better part of 4 decades and who understood precisely what his position was, wrote to the most powerful ruler in the Christian world and reminded him of the facts. The relevant passage, which has survived and been quoted in various translations, makes the point without euphemism. It is well known, Jakob wrote, that your imperial majesty could not have acquired the Roman crown without my help. The phrasing is courteous in its surface register, as correspondence with emperors tended to be. But the meaning is not courteous. It is a creditor in writing, instructing a debtor to remember the nature of their relationship. It is a man who had lent the equivalent of a mountain range in silver, reminding the man who wore the crown that the crown existed, in part because of him. No feudal lord of the previous century could have written such a letter. No abbess, no knight, No even moderately powerful nobleman could have addressed an emperor in those terms and expected to survive the correspondence. Jakob Fugger wrote it because he had the leverage to write it, and the leverage existed because the Fugger firm had made itself genuinely indispensable to the financial functioning of the empire. The letter is the 1519 election compressed into a sentence. It is what it looked like when a system of credit had grown powerful enough to invert, at least for a moment and in private writing, the official hierarchy of the world. And that system of credit was, in those same years, entangled in something else, something that was quietly generating a pressure the Fugger firm had not fully accounted for, and that would eventually, in ways none of the participants could have predicted, reshape the religious landscape of Europe. To understand how, you need to follow a different chain of money, one that ran not from Augsburg to Vienna or to the imperial electors, but from Augsburg through a German archbishop and into the collection boxes of a travelling preacher, and from those collection boxes to Rome. Albrecht of Brandenburg was a young nobleman of considerable ambition and, in 1514, of considerable debt. He wanted, simultaneously, to hold multiple high ecclesiastical offices, the Archbishopric of Mainz, the Archbishopric of Magdeburg, and the Bishopric of Halberstadt, an arrangement that required a papal dispensation and a payment to Rome for that dispensation, and that therefore required money Albrecht did not have. He borrowed from the Fuggers. The sum, combined with the related fees and arrangements, was substantial, somewhere in the range of 21,000 gulden for the confirmation fees, with additional layers of debt on top. The Fugger firm provided the credit. Albrecht got his offices. Now he had to repay. And the mechanism agreed upon was this. Pope Leo X, who needed money for the ongoing and enormously expensive construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, authorized a special indulgence, a grant of spiritual remission available for purchase, the proceeds of which would flow nominally toward the building of the great church. The indulgence would be preached in the territories under Albrecht's jurisdiction, and the proceeds would be split, half to Rome for the basilica, half back toward Albrecht's debt to the Fuggers. The man assigned to preach this indulgence in those territories was a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel, and accompanying Tetzel on his travels, managing the strongboxes and the accounting and the transfer of funds, were agents of the Fugger firm. Think for a moment about what those agents actually represented. They were not priests, they were not theologians. They were bookkeepers and couriers, men trained in the Fondaco dei Tedeschi tradition of Venetian commercial practice, carrying ledgers and letters of instruction from Augsburg into the towns and villages of Germany, watching the coins fall into the boxes, calculating the split, recording the totals, and dispatching reports back through the Fugger correspondence network. The sacred and the financial had been, in this particular arrangement, fused into a single administrative operation, and the Fugger firm was the administrative layer beneath the spiritual surface. Martin Luther, an Augustinian friar and professor of theology at Wittenberg, heard about Tetzel's preaching. He heard or understood through the complaints of his parishioners the rough logic being offered to those who paid, that upon payment the soul of a loved one would be released from the suffering of purgatory. Whether Tetzel used exactly those words in exactly that form is a matter of historical precision. But the popular understanding of what was being sold and the pastoral reality Luther encountered was that salvation had been priced and packaged and was available for coin. In October of 1517, Luther composed his 95 Theses, his arguments against the theology and the practice of indulgences, and sent them to Albrecht of Brandenburg, among others. The protests that followed, the pamphlets, the responses, the widening fracture, all of that is history that belongs partly to theology, partly to politics, and partly to the printing press. But embedded in its first cause, threaded through the accounting of the affair, were the names and the ledgers of the Fugger firm. It would be too much to say the Fuggers caused the Reformation. The chain of causation is longer and more tangled than any single firm or single arrangement. Luther's grievances were theological, and they would have found some occasion eventually, some other indulgence, some other preacher, some other moment of accumulated pressure breaking through a surface already cracked. But the specific indulgence that provoked the specific document that lit the specific fire was one the Fuggers had helped finance and were actively administering when the fire started. They were not bystanders, they were, in the most literal and administrative sense, participants in the machine Luther attacked. And later, in the 1520s, in the debates of the Imperial Reichstag, reformers and populist agitators took aim at the great merchant houses directly, calling for the suppression of what they named monopolies, by which they meant, in large part, the Fugger stranglehold on copper and metals, the ability of a single firm to set prices across an entire market for a strategic commodity. The polemics were sharp and politically motivated, and they should be read with that in mind because those arguing against the Fuggers in the Reichstag were not disinterested observers of economic theory. They were rivals, or they were reformers riding a wave of popular anger, or they were princes who owed money and disliked owing it. The bias runs through the sources, but the underlying reality they pointed to, that the Fugger firm had accumulated a degree of market control over copper that was, by any reasonable definition, extraordinary, was not invented by the polemicists. It was real. What the polemicists could not see or chose not to articulate was how that control had been built, not through force, not through political favor alone, but through something quieter and in some ways more remarkable. A system of information and accounting that made the firm, in an era of slow horses and uncertain roads, among the best-informed institutions in all of Europe. The network had begun, as so much of the Fugger enterprise had begun, as a practical necessity. When you are lending money across borders to a Tyrolean archduke, to a Roman cardinal, to an Antwerp merchant, to an imperial treasurer in Vienna, you need to know things. You need to know whether your borrower is creditworthy, whether the mine producing the ore that will repay your loan is still productive, whether the road through the Brenner Pass is open or closed by snow, whether the political situation in a city where you have an agent has shifted in a direction that might affect your collateral or your contracts. You need to know before your competitors know, because in a world where information travels only as fast as a man on horseback, being 2 days ahead of the next banker is worth real money. The Fugger agents, spread across Augsburg, Antwerp, Venice, Rome, Nuremberg, and beyond, wrote letters. They wrote constantly to each other and to the main house in Augsburg. The letters carried commercial intelligence, prices, arrival of ships, state of roads, political rumors, deaths of princes, movements of armies, decisions of councils. Over time, as the network grew and as the volume of correspondence accumulated, a practice developed of gathering and compiling the information from many correspondents into a single document. A newsletter circulated among those with access to the network. These became known in later years as the Fugger-Zeitungen. The word Zeitungen in German means newspapers. And that is, in a rough way, what they were. Newspapers, before newspapers, private intelligence reports assembled and distributed through a commercial network because information was as much a product of that network as copper or credit. A substantial surviving collection of these newsletters is held today in the Austrian National Library in Vienna. They cover events from across Europe, political intelligence, commercial reports, accounts of battles and disasters and negotiation. They are a window 5 centuries later not only into what was happening in Europe in the 16th century, but into the extraordinary reach of a merchant network that was simultaneously a bank, a mining company, a trading house, and an intelligence service. The Fugger firm did not separate these functions because it did not need to. Information about a copper shipment delayed in Antwerp was the same kind of information as a report of a Portuguese fleet arriving at Lisbon with spices. Both were inputs into the same commercial calculation, and both arrived through the same letter network, and both were recorded in the same ledgers. Those ledgers deserve their own moment of attention, because the bookkeeping the Fuggers employed was not ordinary bookkeeping. Imagine for a moment what it means to track the financial position of a firm with branches in a dozen cities, each operating in different currencies, each with its own loans outstanding and debts owed and goods in transit and agents to pay. The ordinary approach of the era was to keep separate accounts for each location in the local currency and reconcile them only occasionally and imperfectly. What the Fuggers developed, building on the Venetian tradition Jakob had absorbed at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi during his apprenticeship, was something closer to consolidated accounting, the practice of maintaining a unified picture of the firm's position across all its branches in a way that allowed the partners in Augsburg to know, at any given moment, what the whole enterprise owned and owed. Double-entry bookkeeping, recording each transaction as both a debit and a credit, so that the accounts balanced and errors revealed themselves, was the underlying engine. It is not a glamorous subject. It does not have the drama of a coronation or the pathos of a heretic's hammer. But it was, in its way, the technology that made everything else possible. You cannot lend 500,000 gulden across 6 countries without a system that can track 500,000 gulden across 6 countries, and the Fuggers had that system when most of their competitors did not. The Rome operation deserves a particular note. The Fuggers maintained a significant banking presence in Rome, and they were connected to the financial apparatus of the papacy, the institution known as the Apostolic Camera, which was the administrative body responsible for managing papal revenues and expenditures. The Church, in the 16th century, was a vast financial institution as well as a spiritual one. It collected revenues from parishes and dioceses across Christendom. It made payments to its own administrators, its legates, its building projects. It needed constantly to move money across borders, from England, from Germany, from Spain, from France, toward Rome, or from Rome outward to fund its operations. The Fuggers, with their network of agents and their letters of credit, and their ability to transfer funds without physically moving coin, were exactly the kind of institution the papacy needed, and the relationship was profitable in both directions. This is the context in which the indulgence arrangement makes a different kind of sense. The Fuggers were not, in handling the money flows of the Albrecht Tetzel affair, doing something unusual or outside their normal operations. They were doing what they always did, moving money across jurisdictions, tracking the split between parties, reporting back to Augsburg. The fact that the money was nominally sacred did not change the accounting. The coin that fell into Tetzel's collection box was, from the Fugger firm's perspective, coin. It was tracked, it was counted, it was allocated, and it was dispatched. The spiritual dimension of the transaction was, for the ledger, invisible. It is around this time, in the early 1520s, that one sometimes finds cited the estimates of the Fugger family's wealth that have, in later centuries, attracted so much attention. The fortune Jakob Fugger had assembled by this point in his life was extraordinary by any measure, and there are those who have estimated it, with the considerable difficulty that cross-century currency comparisons involve, at something approaching 2% of the total economic output of Europe at the time. That figure should be held lightly. The methodology behind such estimates is heroic in its assumptions. Converting 16th century gulden into modern equivalents requires guesses about purchasing power and economic scale that no historian can make with confidence. What can be said more simply is that the Fugger firm was, in the early 16th century, the single largest private creditor to the major sovereigns of Europe, with a network that stretched from the copper mines of Slovakia to the papal treasury in Rome to the market at Antwerp, and that the wealth represented by those positions was vast in a way that was visible and remarked upon by contemporaries. Luther knew the name, the Reichstag knew the name, princes across Europe knew the name. That is its own kind of evidence. In 1521, the year Luther stood before the Diet of Worms and declined to recant, Jakob Fugger did something that has no obvious parallel among the great financiers of the era. He built a neighborhood. The Fuggerei is a walled settlement within Augsburg, a small city inside the city, consisting of rows of modest, solid, well-made houses arranged along narrow lanes, with its own wells and its own gates that closed at night. Jakob endowed it as a residence for needy Catholic citizens of Augsburg, people who had fallen into poverty through no fault of their own, who needed housing they could not afford, and who met the conditions of residency that Jakob specified in the founding charter. The annual rent was set at 1 Rhenish guilder, the equivalent of roughly 1 week's wages for a skilled labourer at the time. Today that amount has been converted in the official reckoning of the foundation to 88 cents per year. It has not changed in any meaningful sense in the 5 centuries since, but there is a condition the guidebooks mention and then often pass over too quickly. To live in the Fuggerei you must be Catholic, you must be needy through no fault of your own, not through idleness or profligacy or moral failing in the judgment of those who administer the foundation, but through circumstance, and you must pray. 3 times each day, the residents of the Fuggerei are required to say the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Creed, and these prayers are to be offered for the soul of Jakob Fugger and for the souls of the Fugger family. Take a moment to feel the weight of that arrangement. You pay 88 cents a year, and in return the Fugger endowment provides your house. But the endowment is not simply charity in the modern sense. It is a spiritual contract. Jakob Fugger, who died a Catholic in an era when the question of what happened to the souls of the wealthy was pressing and alive, who lived through the beginning of the Reformation and heard the arguments about salvation and works and merit. Jakob Fugger looked at the fortune he had built and thought in the manner of his time about what it meant for the health of his eternal soul. He was a man who had handled the money that flowed through Tetzel's indulgence, who had lent to popes and emperors, who had navigated the boundary between the sacred and the commercial for decades. He understood that wealth, in the theology of his day, was a complication as much as a blessing, and so he built a neighborhood and populated it with people who would pray for him. Every morning, every noon, every evening in the small chapel of the Fuggerei, the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary and the Creed rise from the mouths of those who live there, carrying his name. The Fuggerei was damaged in the bombing of Augsburg in 1944 and afterward rebuilt. It stands today and people live in it today, and the rent remains 88 cents a year, and the prayers, one assumes, continue. Jakob Fugger has been dead for 500 years, and there are still people whose housing depends on praying for his soul. There is something in that arrangement that resists easy categorization. It is not purely generous, not purely calculated, not purely theological. It is all three at once, which is, in a way, a perfect description of the man who created it. Jakob Fugger died in December of 1525. He was 66 years old. He left no children. The man who had built one of the greatest fortunes in European history, who had financed the election of an emperor and the construction of a papal basilica, who had lent money to archduke and cardinal and king alike, who had built a neighborhood still inhabited 5 centuries later. That man died without a direct heir, and the firm passed to his nephew, Anton Fugger. He is buried, along with his brothers, in the Fugger Chapel at St. Anne's Church in Augsburg. The chapel, consecrated in 1518, is considered one of the earliest Renaissance buildings in Germany, a deliberate importation of the Italian architectural style that Jakob had absorbed during his years in Venice, brought north and installed in a German church as a monument to a German family. The tomb is ornamented and dignified and carries in its design the mark of a man who understood that stone outlasts coin, and that monuments, if properly built, can carry a name through centuries when the ledgers have long since dissolved. The epitaph that Jakob composed for himself, or that was composed in his memory, records that he was second to none in the acquisition of wealth. It is not a modest inscription, but then he was not a modest man, and the wealth was real. Anton Fugger, who had been born in 1493 and who would lead the firm until his own death in 1560, inherited a machine of enormous power and considerable momentum. In the years immediately following Jakob's death, the firm continued to grow, reaching perhaps its greatest geographic extent under Anton's direction, with ventures extended toward the Spanish colonial trade, the spice routes, the precious metals flowing from the New World through the harbour at Seville. The wealth that the Spanish conquest of the Americas was beginning to generate, the silver of Potosi in what is now Bolivia, the gold that flowed northward from Mexico, was entering the European financial system, and the Fugger firm was positioned, through its deep relationship with the Habsburg dynasty, to participate in that flow. But participation in the Habsburg system was, by the 1530s and 1540s, no longer the simple advantage it had been in Jakob's time. The relationship had grown so deep, and the Fugger exposure to Habsburg debts had become so large, that the firm's fortunes were increasingly indistinguishable from the fortunes of the Spanish crown. This is the fatal structural flaw that neither Jakob nor Anton could entirely resolve, and it was embedded in the very success that had built the firm. When you are the principal banker to the most powerful dynastic house in Europe, you do not decline to lend. You cannot. The relationship is too important, the protection it provides too valuable, the alternative, being replaced by a competitor who will lend, too costly. And so you lend again and again. And each loan ties you more tightly to a debtor whose reliability, as the 16th century deepened, was becoming less and less certain. The Spanish crown under Charles V spent at a scale that was, even by the standards of the era's most ambitious rulers, extraordinary. Wars in Italy, wars against the Ottoman Empire, wars against the Protestant princes of Germany, the maintenance of a global empire spanning Europe and the Americas and parts of Africa and Asia. The costs were relentless, and they always exceeded revenues, even when those revenues included the silver and gold flowing from the New World. Charles borrowed continuously from German and Genoese bankers, from the Fuggers above all, and the debts accumulated faster than any mine, however rich, could repay them. In 1556, Charles V abdicated, dividing his vast inheritance. His son Philip II inherited Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, the kingdoms of Italy, and the Spanish Empire in the Americas. He also inherited the debts, and in 1557 Philip II declared what the sources of the era called a bancarrota, a suspension of payments, a royal bankruptcy, a forced restructuring of the crown's obligations to its creditors. It was not the first sovereign default in European history, but it was, in its scale and its consequences for the great banking houses of Germany, a financial earthquake. The Fuggers were among those holding large volumes of Spanish crown debt when that first bancarrota was declared. The Spanish debt they held formalized in instruments called asientos, which were short-term lending contracts with the crown, and in juros, which were longer-term Spanish government bonds, became, in the wake of the default, something other than it had been on paper. It was frozen. It was renegotiated at terms the crown dictated, and the creditors could not refuse. It was converted from a claim on the future revenues of a functioning empire into something slower and less reliable, a political obligation that the crown acknowledged in principle but honoured at its own pace and convenience. And then, in 1560, Philip II declared another bancarota, and in 1575 another, and in 1596 another. Consider the arithmetic of that sequence. The Fugger firm made large loans to the Spanish crown. Those loans were recorded as assets on the Fugger books as credits owed to the firm, as the foundation of a portion of the family's wealth. Each default converted some of those assets from reliable claims into uncertain, devalued, or repudiated obligations. The firm could not simply withdraw. The relationship with the Habsburgs was too central, the exposure already too large, the alternative of walking away from the largest debtor in the world not practically available to a firm whose entire operational network was built around serving that debtor's needs. And so the Fuggers stayed and lent again when they could, and waited for repayments that came slowly or not at all, and watched the assets on their books decay. Here is the particular cruelty of the situation. The silver that was flowing into Spain from the Americas, the silver of Potosi and the other New World mines, the silver that was transforming the European money supply and driving prices upward across the continent, was precisely the silver that should have been repaying these debts. Spain was not a poor country. It was, in one sense, the richest country in the world, commanding an empire that produced more precious metal than any power in history had ever controlled. But that silver flowed through the Spanish crown's hands like water through a cupped palm. It came in one side of the treasury and went out the other, to armies in the Netherlands, to fleets in the Mediterranean, to courts and administrators and officials, and the ceaseless machinery of maintaining global empire. The silver that made Spain look inexhaustibly wealthy was precisely the silver that funded the spending that produced the defaults. The Fuggers had helped finance the Habsburg system that mobilized Spanish-American silver, and it was that same silver-fueled overextension that was slowly drowning them. The loop closes quietly without a single dramatic crash. There was no moment when the Fugger firm announced its ruin and the name vanished from the ledgers overnight. It was slower and more mundane than that. Through the late 16th and into the 17th century, the firm withdrew gradually from high finance. The great loans to sovereigns diminished and eventually ceased. The European copper market, once a Fugger domain, shifted and evolved under competitive pressure and the changing metallurgical and colonial realities of the era. The network of agents contracted. The branches in Antwerp and Rome and Venice, which had once been nodes in the most sophisticated private intelligence and credit system in Europe, grew quiet. The family did not disappear. This is important to understand. The Fuggers did not end. They survived their own commercial empire by converting it in the manner that successful European merchant families had converted wealth for centuries into land and title. They became landowners. They became counts of the Holy Roman Empire. The Reichsgraf title that Jakob had received in 1514, the mark of a weaver's great-grandson admitted to the nobility by the emperor he financed, became the foundation of a new kind of status, not the merchant status of credit and correspondent networks, but the nobleman's status of land and lineage. The Fugger family, in its various branches, persisted through the centuries that followed, and persists to the present day. The banking empire dissolved, the family did not, and the Fuggerai still stands. That particular thread from 1521 has never broken, not through the Reformation, not through the 30 Years' War, not through the destruction of 1944, not through the transformations of the centuries between. The houses are there, and the gates close at night, and the rent is 88 cents, and somewhere in the small chapel, the prayers continue. If you walk through the Fuggerai today, you would walk through the oldest continuously inhabited social housing complex in the world, a neighborhood built by a man who is now 5 centuries dead, sustained by an endowment that has outlasted kingdoms and currencies and the very empire whose election it helped to purchase. The bricks are old and solid, the The lanes are narrow and quiet, and the name on the founding charter is Jakob Fugger. He was, near the beginning of his life, meant to be a priest. He held a benefice as a boy, that small ecclesiastical provision that was the first step toward a life in the church, before the family called him away from it and into the counting house. He spent the rest of his life at a kind of uneasy angle to the sacred, financing popes, lending to bishops, handling the money that moved through indulgence campaigns, building housing that ran on prayer. He never became a priest, but the Fuggerei, with its prayer requirement and its 5-century continuity, is in its own strange way a more durable religious institution than many actual churches that were built and fell in the years since 1521. The boy who did not become a priest built something that requires prayer until the end of time, or until the money runs out, whichever comes first. The information engine he built, the double-entry ledgers and the correspondent network and the newsletters now preserved in Vienna, was dismantled more completely than the housing. The Fugger-Zeitungen survive in the Austrian National Library as a historical artifact, a record of what private intelligence looked like before there were public newspapers, before there were wire services, before the idea that anyone could know what was happening in a distant city on the same day it happened. They are remarkable documents, and they are read now by historians who find in them the texture of a world that was just beginning to discover that information, reliably gathered and quickly transmitted, was a form of power. The Fuggers discovered that. They built a system around it. And when the system dissolved, the insight dissolved with it. Not because it was wrong, but because the political risk the firm had taken on, in the form of sovereign debt owed by the Spanish crown, consumed the margin that the information advantage had generated. This is the shape of the story, seen from the outside. A family of weavers registered in a tax roll in 1367 with a name misspelled by a distracted clerk, built over 4 generations a machine of such extraordinary sophistication. Mining and smelting, credit and collateral, correspondence and accounting, papal finance and imperial politics, that one man within that family came to hold in his hands the threads of the most consequential political events of the 16th century. He lent to the man who became emperor. He handled the money that provoked the Reformation. He built housing that still stands. And then the machine, over-leveraged against a single debtor too powerful to refuse and too extended to remain solvent, bled slowly into the long fading that is, in the end, the fate of most things built by human hands. The silver is still there, in the ground and in the historical record. In the mines at Schwaz in Tyrol, where the first great loan was secured against a mountain, and in the hills around Banska Bystrica in Slovakia, where the Thurzó-Fugger company pulled copper from the earth and made it into a market. The mountains are still there. The ore that once secured those extraordinary loans is still in the stone or was extracted long ago, and the debt it represented has long since been settled or dissolved or simply forgotten. But the mountains remain, unchanged by the transactions they once guaranteed, indifferent to the emperors and bankers and reformers who argued over them. The Fugger Chapel at St. Anne's in Augsburg is still there too, the tomb with its Renaissance ornament, the epitaph that says he was second to none in the acquisition of wealth, the bones of a man who financed the world as he found it, and left it permanently altered. He came from a weaver. He ended in stone in a chapel he built himself, in the Italian style he had learned in Venice as a young man, in a German city that was his home from the beginning to the end. That, in the end, is what the name means. Not the gulden figures or the election costs or the letter to the emperor, though all of those are real and remarkable. What the name means is this, that for a brief and extraordinary window of time across roughly one human lifetime, a single family operating out of a single city built a machine complex enough to make the crowning of an emperor dependent on a merchant's decision, to lend and sophisticated enough to know, weeks before anyone else in Europe, what was happening in courts and ports and mines from Lisbon to Rome. And that what undid the machine was not a rival, not a natural disaster, not a war, but the oldest and simplest problem in the history of credit, a borrower who could not or would not pay. The world the Fuggers built their machine inside has dissolved entirely. The Holy Roman Empire is gone, the office of Pope is still there, but the apostolic camera, in the form it took when Fugger agents handed it cash, is not. The Habsburg dynasty no longer rules anything. The mining concessions in Tyrol and Slovakia have passed through centuries of different hands and different economic arrangements. Augsburg is still there, a real city with real streets, and the Fuggerei is still there inside it. But the world that made the Fuggerei necessary, the world of indulgences and gulden and elective emperors and silver mountains pledged as collateral, that world is as distant now as the tunnels beneath Britain or the stones of a Neolithic barrow on a chalk hill. And yet the 88 cents is unchanged, and yet the prayers continue 3 times a day in a small chapel in a walled neighborhood in Augsburg. And yet the newsletters from cities that no longer exist in the forms their writers knew are preserved in a library in Vienna, waiting for whoever wants to read them. Some things persist, not the power, not the wealth, not the machine, but the bricks and the record and the name. The Fugger Chapel is quiet at this hour. The lanes of the Fuggerei are quiet. Somewhere in the Austrian National Library, the newsletters are quiet too, folded in their archival storage, carrying 5 centuries of European news that nobody is reading tonight. Let them rest. You have come a long way from a weaver arriving in Augsburg in 1367, registered in a tax roll under a misspelled name, carrying nothing but the skills of his trade and whatever hope a migrant carries across the plain toward a walled city. You have watched, across the span of a single family's generations, what that beginning became. The textiles, the mines, the credit lines, the imperial election, the letters of correction sent to emperors, the housing built on prayer, the slow erosion of a fortune lashed to a debtor who could not be refused and would not reliably pay. And now the night is here, and the story has reached its end, and there is nothing left to explain. The mountains are still standing, the Fuggerei is still standing. The name is in the stone. That's enough explaining for one night. Rest now